the mother said to her son, Marlene said to Brian, son, I've got to be there for you. I was there when you came in this world. I'm going to have to be there to give you a face of love to look at when you leave this world. And he said, absolutely not, Mom. I can't let this be your last image of me. It will haunt you the rest of your life. They went back and forth a little bit. She kept trying to convince him, and he kept adamantly saying no, because he knew that it would be horrifying for her to see that. So then she turned to me at one point and said, Sandy, you're his only friend. I'll feel better honoring my son's request if you will go in my place.
Hi everyone, I'm in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania today. I wanted to start this episode here in front of the Independence Hall. It's in this building that in 1787, 39 delegates signed the US Constitution. Among them was George Washington or Benjamin Franklin. From 1972 to 1976, the US Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty had to be abolished. They said it was unconstitutional because it was applied arbitrarily. But in 1976, the US Supreme Court reversed its decision, and since then, 1,500 people have been executed in the US. And there is no chance that in the near future, the US Supreme Court will abolish the death penalty again. I'm here in Philadelphia today because I'm going to meet Sandra Joy. She's a professor in sociology for Rowan University, and she's done a great job about the death penalty, and she's going to share her insights about it with us today.
My name is Sandra Joy. I'm a sociology professor at Rowan University, and I've also been an abolitionist against the death penalty for about 3 decades now.
Thank you very much for being interviewed for Death Row Stories. Before we dive into your work, we'd like to know you a little bit more. Can you tell us where you grew up exactly, and a little bit about your youth?
I was raised in Virginia, in the South, in a very small town, with my 2 parents, who were very religious, evangelical, Southern Baptist. And that's significant to the story because the church that I go to, was raised in when I was a child, is very pro-life, meaning they don't support abortion. However, and I later learned they're the only, or at least when I went to graduate school and uncovered a little bit more information, they're the only Protestant denomination that has a written position in support of the death penalty. So being raised in Virginia, the cradle of slavery, where it started, and it's a very racist state in terms of institutional racism for many, many years. And the Southern Baptist Church is also very racially divided. I was made conscious at a young age about the racism in the town because I would watch the news and see people being reported that they were going to be executed, and they were almost always Black. And then I would go to church and they would say, we're pro-life. But then I learned somehow, I'm trying to remember how I don't remember how it came about, but I learned that the church I was raised in was claiming to be pro-life when it comes to abortion, but very much so pro-death penalty. And that contradiction never sat well with me. We were at the church easily 4 or 5 days a week. It was a very insulated community, and so focused on evangelical Christianity that it was a big part of my world coming up. And I didn't even know there was a movement against the death penalty until I moved up to the Northeast to go to graduate school at Temple University in Philadelphia. And it was my first semester there as a grad student of sociology. And I was in the elevator, and a fellow student, a cohort above me, welcomed me. She came in the elevator and said, welcome to Temple. How's your first semester going? And we were just chatting. And she said, what do you want to do your dissertation on? And I was like, easy, let me get through my coursework first. But all I know is when I get to that level to do the dissertation, it's got to be something focused on the death penalty because I've always been against it my whole life. And her eyes brightened and she said, oh, you have to come to a meeting with me. And my eyes brightened. I'm like, meeting? there's a movement? She's like, yes. So she took me to the Pennsylvania Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty meeting, PCADP. This is in the early 90s, 30 years ago.
One of your first work on the death penalty was this very strange thing that it's mainly white people fighting against the death penalty, and it's a lot of Black people on death row. How can you explain that as a sociologist?
When I went to this first meeting with the young woman I met in the elevator, her name was Linda, I was expecting to be the only white person in the room. But all of the people who were there were white, older, and I learned pretty quickly, expressed their opposition to the death penalty in moral and religious terms. So they were Quaker and Catholic primarily, and they saw the death penalty as immoral, which I've come, and I did agree with that on the basis of the racism, but also, just it's immoral for a state to have that power to kill someone is problematic. That's a human rights issue, but it's also immoral, I believe, for us to take a life. So that resonated with me, and I knew then what I was going to do my dissertation on. I was going to explore, why is it that you have so many white people who couldn't be more different demographically than the people on death row?
And let's jump to the conclusion. How can you explain this?
When I did my research, I found that there's a number of external reasons to the movement and some internal to the movement. I wanted to blame the movement because they were framing the issue as a moral religious one and not a racial political one, which would not stand to mobilize people along the lines of race. So I wanted to blame the movement, and there is some blame. There was and still is some blame, less so today. We're doing better. This was in the early 90s, for that the movement has to bear as to why it's so white, middle class, professional. But external to the movement, when you are a person of color in the United States, you're trying to make ends meet. There's a disproportionate number of Black people on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. So they have less, it's a luxury to go to a movement meeting and to attend events because time is of the essence. Not to mention that there are so many fronts to face racism and to fight racism in our nation. They couldn't think about that guy as quickly or easily, I should say, who might be executed 10 or 20 years down the road. They're facing racism at their job, racism in the school system, racism in their neighborhoods. So there's too many fronts to fight racism. So it was interesting nonetheless, because when you look historically and to this day at public opinion polls in the United States around the death penalty, overwhelmingly, it's always been that the Black community opposes the death penalty at a higher rate than the white community. So that's another reason I expected to see more Black people involved in the movement. They're more likely to oppose it. Why not be the more likely to be on the front lines of the movement? They're most likely to be directly impacted by it. As a social movement student or studying social movement theory in grad school, I learned that most social movements are comprised of the constituents are the people who stand to benefit most directly from the gains of the movement. And then I saw this movement, it couldn't be any more different demographically. So I concluded there's a number of factors, and I don't want to take up too much time to go into it, but the factors were both external that I mentioned. There are no fault of the movement, but there were quite a few that were fault of the movement because it's been called a savior complex on the left, the white savior complex. There's a lot of racism rears its ugly head in lots of ways. You don't have to have a white hood on to be a racist in the United States. It comes in the form of paternalism or in patronizing, we're going to help you poor others with your problems and not involving the people being impacted by the problem themselves. And so where the right has been accused, and fairly so, by blatant overt racism in a lot of their policies and even at least pre-civil rights in their speech and the way they carry themselves, the left, the liberals, not the radical left so much, but our progressives, but the liberals, neoliberalism has been accused of being patronizing and with their racism. And this is why Jordan Peele did his film, by the way, Get Out, to expose that neoliberal sort of perspective. And so I found good people in the movement, wonderful people that were kind. And I, on the one hand, they didn't have to come out and fight for that guy on death row. They could ride on their white privilege and their class privilege because they tend to be pretty well off or comfortable at least. So on the one hand, I'm eternally grateful for them to do this. They're called conscience constituents. People move by their conscience and not by the impact on their life. At the same time, I felt like they were, in a lot of ways, doing more harm than good when it comes to recruiting people of color. Because when you look at historically in the United States, when white people have entered a lot of the movements that are intended to disproportionately benefit people of color, they've been suspect because they come in like, we're going to help you fix your problem and it's going to be all better and you just wait. As opposed to doing participatory action with them and having them take the reins. There were very, very few families of death row inmates in the movement, death row exonerees, or people directly impacted by the death penalty. And definitely disproportionately fewer people of color, Black people, as well as any other communities of color in the movement. We've made some gains, and we actually have done a better job of centering them in our movement. Some organizations more than others, but but the blame that could be laid on the movement would be around things like framing it in a way that didn't resonate as much with the everyday lives of Black people. By framing it as a religious issue or moral one. Not that there aren't obviously religious and people with high morals in the Black community, but to really connect the racism with the movement to the racism in their everyday lives. And the other thing was not just the way it was framed, but where strategically they were meeting. They were meeting in Episcopalian churches or the Quaker Meeting House. They weren't going into the streets. They weren't going into communities and asking people in the communities of color who have leadership positions to help, not to help, but to lead an event in their area. And honestly, there were a lot of white people at that time that I interviewed who didn't want to pay attention to race because they said they were, mind you, this is the early 90s, and we were fully into the backlash to the civil rights movement. And they would outright say to me, the race card doesn't play anymore, Sandy. We can't really talk about race. People in positions of power don't want to hear about race. So I'm not racist, they would say. And of course, I oppose it, but we can't really talk about it. It doesn't really play. And I would talk to the Black activists. They were like, of course we have to talk about it. This is a big part of what's going on. And whether they're ready to hear it or not. So I saw a lot of white fragility, and that's a common term being used to refer to white people who are uncomfortable with dialogue around race. I felt they were hiding behind that the race card doesn't work argument to hide their own form of racism, which again is not in your face, and they would never say racial slurs, but they weren't ready really to do interracial work. It wasn't a concern. It wasn't a concern around most of the people in the movement. There were some people, and there was a group that I joined that was very, very different. The campaign to the death penalty was very racially diverse and included people front and center who'd been directly impacted.
After that, you also worked on the grief process of the people who lost their father because their father was executed. Can you tell me how many of them you met and why is this grief unique?
After I got involved in the movement and I noticed the missing component of movement activists being the people most directly impacted, the state that I was in Delaware is where I went in to start this research. At the time, there were 16 men on Delaware's death row, and I wanted to meet them to earn their trust enough to give me the contact information of their family members. And one by one, I did that because I wanted to hear from them how this is affecting them, first and foremost. And then how can we, the movement against the death penalty, incorporate them in a way that would help them while their loved one was on death row through the grieving process. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker, and I had done some mental health and drug counseling before I became a college professor. And one of my areas of specialty was grief counseling. And so I was helping people who are grieving ordinary everyday losses. And there were 70 family members I interviewed. And as I began to interview them, I noticed pretty quickly that their grief was indeed and is, those families with loved ones on death row, very unique in that they're disenfranchised from their grief. There's a concept I had learned from the death literature, death, dying, and bereavement literature and research called disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief had been used to refer to cases of like pet loss. When people say, "Oh, I'm sorry about your dog, you can get another one," but it's minimized. Another example, miscarriage. "Oh, I'm so sorry. You can get pregnant again." And that's a very devastating loss a lot of times for the woman who has a miscarriage and the partner. So I knew about the concept of disenfranchised grief. And when I met the families of death row inmates, I right away knew that this was like probably the best example of disenfranchised grief I could ever think of. Because not only does society fail to recognize their grief, because they don't consider that this monster on death row actually has people that love him or her, they actually go so far, total strangers, mind you, on op-eds and on newspapers leading up to the execution or right after the alleged murder has happened and the person's put on death row, and definitely chanting in the pen at the time of an execution, calling for the death of their loved one. Complete strangers. So death row families, I found pretty quickly, are very isolated with their grief. They have a hard time trusting the larger society to be there for them if they were to share. So if they meet a stranger, and let's say a mother of a man on death row meets a stranger in the grocery store and say, "How many kids do you have?" They may not mention the kid on death row because they don't feel safe in this society. I had family members actually tell me that when they would reveal it, that total strangers who are people they barely knew would say things like, "Aren't you glad the state is taking this demon seed out of your family? Why are you grieving? Why are you even sad? You should be happy that the state is helping take this person out of your family." They literally cannot understand how people can love this horrible person, this monstrous person on death row. So as a result, they are very isolated and they grieve in silence, and they feel a great bit of shame already because the system has already criminalized them along with their loved one.
Maybe we can say a word about some wives you've met and how deep the trauma can be.
A case that comes to mind is my friend Shakira. Her husband was on Delaware's death row, and she didn't trust too many people to talk about it. She was grieving a great deal. I was actually with her on the night that her husband was executed. And she had met him by working for the Delaware Center for Justice and gone to help men on death row, and fell in love with him, wound up marrying him before he was executed about 4 years prior. And she felt alienated from the people she had worked with. Her husband was a remarkable man, had made a great deal of change in his life. So actually there were, more than many of the other executions in Delaware, a lot of administrators and COs, correction officers, who were very sympathetic towards him because they all grew to really care for this man, as you might see in some of these cases around the nation. So that helped a little bit, but she felt very isolated. She witnessed the execution, regretted that, has had major health problems ever since. And she knows it's a mind, body, spirit thing. You know, she's had to battle over the years, and she's gotten a little bit better, but it really made her isolated. And she had been a very outgoing, um, lively person, very much extroverted, and she became very introverted and wound up staying inside because she felt like, as many family members say, that when they killed my husband, they killed me. And I've had kids say that too. If they kill my daddy, they're gonna kill me too. They're gonna hurt my heart, you know? And I'll just briefly mention that one case in Delaware that of a son that is just heart-wrenching, is his father had killed his mother they were estranged, and he had set the house on fire. He was high on drugs, and his 2 sisters and his mom and his sister's friend were in the house for a sleepover, and he was across the street at his grandmother's. He was only 7, and he watched the house go in flames, and he lost his mother and his 2 sisters and a neighborhood friend, and this mother of the father, who Marcus was with at the time that this happened, would leave groceries in the store, leave laundry at the laundromat because she would overhear people say that's the mother of the baby killer, and so she very much would just isolate. And so he got close to his father during the time that his dad was on death row, who was extremely remorseful for what he had done during, and this is not to excuse it, but he was not in his right mind. In fact, he stumbled into a neighbor's yard and had them call the police, and he didn't deny it. And by the time his father was executed, Marcus was 16, and I'll never forget seeing him standing outside in the pen with the abolitionists who surrounded him, would love to support him throughout his dad's execution. He was like, now my family's gone. My mom, my daughter, and my sisters, and now my dad is gone too. And they had become very close during that time. So it's not that when we kill somebody on death row, we're killing all these other people that many times murder victim family members don't want it to happen even, and that's in a whole other area.
Is there a pattern of trauma from all these family members that you saw as a sociologist?
It could take many forms in terms of self-destruction. Shakira's husband's son wound up going to jail after he went to many hospitals for he was suicidal, and then he became homicidal, and he wound up committing a murder. Now he's in a prison. So I remember speaking to the pardon board saying, death penalty can't, if the death penalty was meant to deter murder, you would think it would at least deter somebody in the family who was close to it. So the trauma extends to schooling because a lot of times the kids in particular are singled out, particularly if they have a name and it's been in the press that's similar to their father. Children have gone into classrooms and seen, one child was 12 and she went in and saw a picture of her brother on the wall because they were going to be talking about the death penalty in her social studies class, and all the death row inmates were on the wall, and she was horrified to find out they were going to be talking about her brother. The school didn't know that it was her brother because they don't talk about it because they're suffering in silence. She ran out of the classroom upset, and it was shared. I had another 15-year-old kid who found out her dad was being sent to death row while at school by another kid at a locker who had read the newspaper first, because the system prepares murder victim family members for the news, but they don't take time to call the family of the person who's being sent to death row to give the mother heads up. Keep your kids home today. There's this horrible thing that's going to break in the news. They do it for the murder victim family members. So they oftentimes, here's another very important part that I focused on in my research and in the book that I wrote, don't seek therapy because they're so ashamed. They've internalized so much shame and about what's happened with their loved one, and they don't necessarily trust that the therapist might be pro-death penalty. And can you imagine bearing your soul to someone in their mind is a part of the very death machine that's going to kill their loved one, if only by their silence, because it's our tax dollars that go to an execution. So it's kind of one of those things, if you don't speak out against it, you're complicit through your tax dollars, if nothing else. And so it made it really hard for them to reach out. So not only are they traumatized, and the trauma carries all areas in the community and the school, and it comes out through self-destructive ways, anger issues with these children. They might start skipping school, getting involved in criminal behavior of their own. Mothers oftentimes become very depressed. Many of them are heavily sedated. And they might go see a therapist, but not really talk about what's causing it. So not only are they manifesting all this trauma, they don't feel safe to go and get traditional mental health therapy. And they may have been in a demographic group that wasn't prone to do that anyway, but they're especially less likely to get therapy now because they're concerned about how they'll be perceived.
You're a researcher, you're a professor, you're also an activist because you're really against the death penalty. And is there a clear border between being an activist and being a professor and a researcher?
Because I am a death penalty abolitionist. Um, I felt that this research and speaking about it and teaching about the death penalty, excuse me, with my students and classes and just educating the community was a form of activism for me. I mean, yes, I do and have been for many years go to protest and speak out and do, town hall meetings, et cetera, et cetera. But by doing this work around the grief and loss issues that death row families face, I felt like it was helping me put a face on this side of the issue, one that we have not seen enough of. Certainly, the murder victim family members deserve to have their story told. Certainly, they deserve to have our empathy. I don't think it's a either or. I think it's a both and. But because not only should we be paying attention to the grief and loss of a murder victim family member, but if we're going to have this thing called the death penalty in the United States, we have to consider its impact on the people that we're killing, because we are creating, in essence, as a state institution, the death penalty, more victims. And so we need to know. And so I felt like doing this work, doing this research was very nicely helping feed my activist soul, in that I could now go out and protest and say, I've gathered this research and this is how it's impacting families. Is this what we want? Is this what we want as a society? Can't we do better? So it's not just an ideological position any longer. It's one that I can base on data and research that I've gathered. Um, and as a professor, I've been fortunate enough to have the support of my colleagues in my university to do this work, and that they welcome. At the university I teach in New Jersey, we don't have the death penalty. New Jersey abolished it 15 years ago, and they hadn't executed in 40 years prior. So it was more of a, just a symbol, and it wasn't in practice. But so they very much supported that work. Along the way, over the last 30 years now of this work as an activist, then a professor, because I was a therapist at first, right? Doing the grief counseling while I was doing my activism at first. And then a professor and a researcher now, and all my research has been around death penalty or life without parole issues. I have found nothing but new reasons to oppose the death penalty. A lot of social issues and social problems are conflicting. We take a position one side or another when we weigh out the different issues of the problem, and like, this is a tough one. I come down on this side, even though I do see that side. With the death penalty, I don't have that wavering at all. I can adamantly oppose it because I believe in restorative justice, not retributive justice. And that, coming from that perspective of what justice should look like, vengeance is not on the table for me. It doesn't save us any money. It's way more expensive, as people know who look into this, to have the death penalty. It's racist in its application. It's not a deterrent. It doesn't make us safer, on and on. There's every reason to oppose it. It creates, and then with the family members, I found it creates more victims. As a sociologist, my strongest argument against the death penalty that I've come to share with my students, even today in a class that I was teaching, when I was asked about this position, I said, as a sociologist, we believe in the nurture side of the nature versus nurture debate, right? Yes, there are some things that we are born with. They're predisposed to certain personality characteristics and certain maybe even mental illnesses, but it's nurture, meaning the environment and society, that either helps us along and helps us responds to those any deficiencies we may have, and taps on and pulls out the strengths and helps create who we become, one way or the other. And so, since I believe that as a sociologist, when people, because I'm against the death penalty for everybody. It's easy to say we're against it for the innocent, but I'm very adamantly opposed for the guilty as well. So I have no apologies for that. when people are guilty of the capital murder they've been accused of and found guilty and put on death row, I have an easy time defending them as a sociologist because I know that person was not born that way. They weren't born as a baby destined to become a murderer. Society failed them. We failed them as a society. We ignored their trauma that sometimes is intergenerational. They were in poverty. They faced racism, and I could go on and on about all of the things that caused that kid to fall through the cracks and to turn to a life of crime and eventual murder. So we should not be then putting all the blame on them. It's really, we contributed to this. And we owe it to them to say, wow, this is a horrible thing you did. I don't want to ignore that, but we need to treat you with compassion and humanitarian and not kill you. At least you might need to be incarcerated, and you might never get out if you're too damaged to come home. And hopefully you can heal and come home. But if you can't, then we owe them to that because we created that.
That's a perfect way to dive into another research you did about life without parole, saying that a lot of anti-death penalty activists say that we should use life without parole. And what you're saying as a sociologist is that it can even be worse in a certain way than the death penalty. What do you mean?
With the research I did with some colleagues around life without parole, we determined that LWOP, as it's called often, is worse than death because there's more ways to kill a person than just physically, spiritually, and to isolate them and to have them for the rest of their so-called natural life sit in a cell is inhumane. That's why so many other parts of the world are not only anti-death penalty, but they're not even supportive of LWOP. So we do have other examples around the world.
But many activists are going to say, no, anything is better than the death penalty than to kill someone, right?
The research that I did for this LWOP book, I went back to Delaware's death row. They abolished the death penalty in Delaware in 2016. About 5 years later in 21, I found they were in a unique position to speak to both sentences. They lived under a death sentence, and now they're living under LWOP. So I surveyed all of them and asked them, I said, look, I'm out here saying LWOP is worse than death, but I want to make sure I've got you in my back pocket as I'm saying this. Do you agree? Because I feel like it's a false choice that we either fight the death penalty and offer LWOP, because if we don't, then more people are going to die while we're fighting both. I don't believe that's the case. Many people don't believe that's the case. If we frame our reason for being against the death penalty because inhumanity involved, we simply extend that inhumanity to LWOP and fight them both at the same time. I found when I interviewed these men, and at this point there were 12 remaining who hadn't been executed on Delaware's doing LWOP, who'd been on the death row, they all said fight them both. We would rather risk, if they were still on death row, we would rather risk execution than be dying here, because it's a very bleak life, watching the elders above them wither away to nothing, with family disappearing and not having that support. And they said this is worse. And many of them, a handful of them, said they wish they'd been back on death row because obviously they want to be home. But if they had to choose between the two, it's difficult sitting there in the general population and watching people come and go, getting second and third and fourth chances, and they won't even be given one chance. So they see hard-headed young people coming and going, and then they see the elders dying, being wheeled into a corner and being fed because they can't even feed themselves. And they know that's a certain fate of them one day when they become elders. So this is the two things that they're seeing on a daily basis, knowing they never have a chance to come home. And at least they didn't have to be exposed to that when they were sitting. And they could, when they had enough, I had one person tell me on death row, he goes, I kind of want to go back there, because when I've had enough, I got to kill myself here. When I've had enough on death row, I can turn down my appeals and they can kill me.
But there are little chance that the death penalty would be abolished in a lot of states if there wasn't a life without parole as an option, right?
That is what I'm being told by a lot of death penalty attorneys, and it is a valid argument that it's a card to be played. And I feel like it's kind of silly to expect. In fact, I had this conversation with many abolitionists over the years who are pro LWOP. Hey, you people, lawmakers and politicians and stuff, I know we've been asking for LWOP and you got rid of the death penalty. Well, now we want to get rid of LWOP. To be like, get out of here. Because they would say to me, Sandy, after we get rid of the death penalty, then we'll get rid of LWOP. I don't think that it's necessarily going to happen because it's sealing a fate for people that they have to live. And they're saying that it's worse than death. And I'm not saying that some of them aren't grateful that they're not having the threat of death hanging over their head anymore, and certainly the families. But the family's fate changes too. From waiting for that phone call when a death warrant's signed and they have to go down and possibly witness an execution or at least have to say goodbye to their loved one, to now going down for the rest of their lives and seeing them wither away and seeing all of the unmet milestones, and it's very, very painful for the families as well. And I had some families say, please don't tell my loved one this, but if they're going to kill him anyway, let's do this. I can't take this anymore, living under the threat. And when it came to LWOP, they would say, many of them would say, at least I get to see my family, my loved one. And yes, that's something. But some others would say, this is very painful. And now I've got to do this the rest of my life.
I see what you did, but a lot of people are going to tell you those death row inmates, they're not the ones to whom we should ask when they think about this.
I didn't want to be one of those liberals who says, this is what I'm going to do for you without including them. And I feel like it's important to have their voice. So not so much because I feel like those 12 people are going to make any difference in the people that hold the power for their fate, so much as I think that it's important for those of us in the movement who are advocating and raising our wine glasses, our champagne glasses to celebrate when the death penalty is abolished and now those people are being sent to another form, death by incarceration, we call it. Life without parole is death by incarceration, and celebrating the people who are being put in another part of the prison and left there with no automatic representation anymore. They might even be innocent. And you may have heard it said, it's better to be innocent on death row than to be innocent with LWOP. At least on death row, you have automatic representation, the better chance of getting off of death row. Once you're giving a life without parole sentence, there's no automatic representation. So I know actually 2 people out of the 12, I feel fairly certain are innocent, that they are now being thrown in Delaware, who have now been thrown into LWOP sentence, and they don't get that same chance to prove their innocence. Who, even innocent people I've heard say, look, I want the full extent of this, and if it's not going to work for me, I don't want to be here. There are movements, and I'm involved in one here in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania called CADB, Coalition Against Death by Incarceration, who are trying to change LWOP to life with the possibility of parole to give people opportunities to redeem themselves.
Your more recent work focused on the people who witnessed executions and their trauma. Can you tell us about this?
This work evolved from my earlier work with death row family members and the men on Delaware's death row about their grief and loss issues. In the course of doing that work, I got to know the men on Delaware's death row and their families quite well. And nearing the end of my data collection with those families, during that time, one of them got a death warrant. And so I was at a visit with the mother. I took the mother down to see her son. And the mother said to her son, Marlene said to Brian, son, I've got to be there for you. I was there when you came in this world. I'm going to have to be there to give you a face of love to look at when you leave this world. And he said, absolutely not, Mom. I can't let this be your last image of me. It will haunt you the rest of your life. They went back and forth a little bit. She kept trying to convince him, and he kept adamantly saying no, because he knew that it would be horrifying for her to see that. So then she turned to me at one point and said, Sandy, you're his only friend. I'll feel better honoring my son's request if you would go at my place. And I didn't hesitate, because going would allow me to give this mom some peace, knowing that her son had a face of somebody who cared about him to look at while he was being killed by the state, in addition to being there for Brian himself. And as it turned out, his cousin, who also wanted to be there, but not by herself. So I could give her somebody to lean on. That experience, I don't have time to go into all the details about it, but it was horrific and I was traumatized. It was deemed botched by the AP journalist who witnessed because it took him far longer to die than anybody else in Delaware. The sedative wasn't working. He kept waking up, and it was horrific to watch. I was outraged. I was traumatized to the point that I had to seek therapy 6 months later because I was having a hard time dealing with my anger and my just outrage, my righteous indignation about what I'd seen. So I saw a therapist and worked through my own trauma, but I'll never forget looking around the room, in the witnessing room, at all the parties who were involved in Brian's execution. And I remember thinking to myself, this is very traumatic. How are you all dealing with this? Because it's very ceremonial, it's very sterile, it's very quiet, and everybody's just like there to see. But it was like risers, sort of like when you go to a show at Disney World and you have like people wrapped around up on risers and watching this, and it felt theatrical in a horrific way. And all these years later, because this has been nearly 20 years ago that I witnessed Brian's execution. It was 2005 in November 4th. And so even though I processed my own experience, I sought therapy, I even published an autoethnographic account of it. I always wanted to return to the subject because I wanted to know how it affects other parties. As a sociologist, we know that the same event can be taken in a multitude of different ways by all the witnesses of the event, depending on what they bring to the table, right? We all have backgrounds. We all are influenced by so many things, so we might take very different things away from the exact same event. So I knew that. And I knew the parties who were there for different reasons. So I decided to take on this very ambitious project and interview 8 different categories of witnesses at a typical execution. And so I asked for a sabbatical. I applied for sabbatical leave. I took a year off from my academic teaching job. I got an RV, took my dog, and I traveled across country. I went through 35 states to stop in 25.
What came out of this?
Yes. As I interviewed all of the different parties about their witnessing experience, I found that every one of them were impacted in one way or another. Some of them wouldn't call it trauma, but I know enough as a trauma grief therapist to observe nonverbals and things that are said to know that there's been some trauma. Many of them said this was very traumatizing. I couldn't sleep. I had basically PTSD symptoms from it. And that included everybody from wardens and COs and journalists and spiritual advisors, defense attorneys, family members and loved ones of the condemned person and family of the victim, and even death row inmates who had formerly been on death row I interviewed because even though they don't witness the event, they witnessed the final moments leading up to it and it impacted them as well. So my conclusion thus far, even though I'm in the process of writing up my findings, I've interviewed 114 people from these 8 different categories. I still have others I'd like to interview as I'm writing, but I think it's safe for me to say from my preliminary findings that this is asking too much of witnesses to sit there and watch this, regardless of the reason you're there, whether you're there to fulfill a job, to be a minister to the one who, as a spiritual advisor, to see your client through that you've been defending for 10, 20, 30, 40 years sometimes on death row to the bitter end, or family members seeking some form of justice or revenge if you're a family of the victim, or just solace from the family of the condemned. Everybody's there for a different reason, but regardless, and even some of the surprising categories of people who you might think are pro-death penalty and really are and were, they didn't find closure. They found themselves disillusioned by the system and angry about what they saw. So I think that we need to rethink the death penalty for sure. I was already primed to think that from my activism, but interviewing all these people confirmed for me that we're asking too much of people because the trauma that they walk away from is everlasting for many of them. And it impacts them in many ways.
But a lot of people think that the victims of the family will be happy to see that murderer who killed their daughter, who killed their son, their loved one, being executed.
Absolutely. And it is certainly the case that many of the victim family members who walk away from execution do feel like some measure of justice has been done at least. But what I heard more often than feeling like justice was done was just the relief that a chapter was closed. And many of them went so far as to be opposed to the death penalty who I talked to because they felt like, okay, this is over, but it didn't do anything for me. It didn't bring my loved one back. It didn't really give me the closure I was seeking. And some of them went so far as to say, this chapter, this horrific chapter could have been closed many years earlier with a life sentence or some other sentence where they don't have to keep coming to trial for all these appeals and being interviewed by the press every time the man who killed their loved one is up for an appeal and they're now in execution. They're like, enough already. They just want it closed, and this is the way they see it. But when I would ask them if there was another way for that chapter to be closed without you having to worry about that person ever harming you or anybody else in society again, they said many of them absolutely. Some of them, and I didn't get to as many as I would like. I'm still interviewing people, but a significant portion of those I interviewed who were seeking some form of closure, justice, or revenge, however they wanted to frame it, were disillusioned at the end and did not find that it gave that to them at all. In fact, seeing, and one person in particular in Oklahoma was there to witness the man who killed her grandparents being executed. And she left furious because now she was made to feel badly to watch the daughter of the man right in front of her. She could see through the glass because they had the victim's family in a separate area, but she could look down and see her, the daughter of the man who's being executed, crying. And she said, "This is horrible. Now this young woman's father's been taken from her." And this person I interviewed said they could have maybe done something to patch him up, to be some kind of dad to her from behind bars. But now she will never be able to have a relationship with her father. And it's being done in the name of my grandparents. So this young woman named Lindsay, has written op-eds and been outspoken against the death penalty ever since. And she was not against the death penalty until she witnessed it, because she said, what I saw back there in that room was pure evil, and I don't want any part of it. And she was outraged it was being done in her name. So she felt more inclined, just like the murder victims' families for reconciliation group of families against the death penalty do overall, and compelled to speak out. So there was a range of reactions. Certainly there were some who said, yeah, I felt like I got justice, but it wasn't, they often said that same justice or same closing of a chapter could have been accomplished in another way. It didn't have to be on the death of somebody.
Can we say a word about the wardens? A lot of them are in favor of the death penalty, and I think it's a good thing they are if they do that job. But still, they get a trauma after many years, and sometimes not immediately, right? They don't realize how traumatizing it is.
Absolutely. So I was fortunate enough to interview about 7 wardens in a variety of states: Florida, Texas, California, Ohio, across the country throughout my travels. And all but one oppose the death penalty now out of the 7. And they're all retired. They're not actively engaged in. 2 of them have become abolitionists and are very outspoken. Ron McAndrew in Florida is one such warden. His reason for being opposed is the trauma it brought to his team. He said, I am speaking on behalf of the execution team and the wardens. It's traumatizing because they get to know these men, largely men and women, throughout their time on the row and work alongside of them every day. Texas does have a different set. They've got this down to a fine art in Texas. They were rather wise, I guess you could argue, at some point to have a separate execution team from the ones who supervise them on a daily basis. So at least it's not the same people who know them. But even still, many of them are traumatized. One in particular, Fred Allen, who's been out speaking in Texas about how he stopped after Carla Faye was executed. He couldn't do it any longer. But another one who in Texas, Mr. Willett, who wrote a book about his experience, said, we don't need the death penalty. And he supervised, I want to say over 60, it was double digits of executions. And he wasn't necessarily in the front lines of the movement, but he was very quick to say, yeah, I've rethought the death penalty ever since. I think that doing their job, so to speak, is obviously something that's important to them. They want to do it well, but the ones that I spoke to, all said that it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost in terms of feeling like they have participated in the killing of another person in a very direct way, and then watching the team of people being traumatized. There's a person I had hoped to interview, Don Cabana. He died before I could talk to him, who wrote a book called Death at Midnight, and I actually saw him speak in Delaware many years ago. And his final moment that made him actually quit was he had overseen many executions in Mississippi, and he was the type of warden who would walk death row and he didn't just stay in his office. He would get to know them personally. And so he asked the person who was being executed in the holding room, have you gotten right with your God? Are you ready to go? Have you gotten right with your God? And he said, I'm fine with my God. How are you with yours? And Don Cabana said he went home. He spoke about this many times before when he wrote his book and before he died. And he said he couldn't sleep all night. He kept thinking, because he was prided himself on being a Catholic, a practicing Catholic. And he said, I'm not really good with my God. You're right, because the person seemed at peace and then he wasn't. So he quit at that point and he became an abolitionist and spoke out against the death penalty. Ironically, and this might be interesting to know, he became a criminal justice professor, but then he decided to go back into the same prison and be a warden again, because he said, when people are like, why would you do this again? Well, as long as they have the death penalty, they need to have a warden who cares about them and can speak out on their behalf. And so that was a very selfless act for him. Might have contributed to a premature death for all I know, in terms of what it did to his heart and soul to be there as a death penalty opponent and a warden at the same time practicing. But I thought that was a wonderful and really tough decision for him to make, to want to be there for them, even though he opposed the death penalty at that point, just because he said, well, they've got this, so they need somebody who cares to be there.
So when you did that study about these people who witnessed executions, you were in your RV all around the US. Is there a particular case you want to talk about?
A case that really comes to mind is that of Christine. Her brother was executed in Arizona, and they were horrifically abused. Robert Towery is his name. And Christine is a sister who saw him throughout his time. When he was a little boy, she and her older sister got out from the mom, who was horribly abusive. And there are details of that abuse online, because she's told her story in many venues, and even the parole hearing shows that. But she said, having to say goodbye to him and through glass, putting their hands on the glass and saying goodbye, and he was crying. She said it took her back to the moment when she and her sister left home to get away from the abuse, and he was a little 6-year-old boy crying, like, don't leave me. And she always had guilt about leaving him, because he got the brunt of the abuse. By her not being there to protect him the way she had prior, she felt somewhat responsible for the path that he took. And so she, when he was charged with murder and went to jail, she would visit him on a regular basis. But I interviewed a lot of people around the case, the attorney, the journalist, the sister, and they all were very moved by this man who had changed tremendously during his time on death row. He'd been on drugs and not in his right state of mind when the murder happened, not to excuse it, but to explain it. So those are the kind of family member stories that really got to me. And it's the murder victim family members that probably got to me equally, if not more, because who were rethinking and just their thoughts and just talking about the trauma they go through from the time of the arrest all the way to the execution, made worse by the death penalty. It's already bad enough to have a loved one murdered, sometimes in front of them or with them. But then to go through this trauma of this um, whole being dragged through this public way of having to keep picking at the wound of their loss and then the execution. So, yeah, the stories of the families on either side really got to me because you could just feel the pain. I felt vindicated in seeing some professionals. I'm not an attorney, I'm a researcher, I'm a sociologist, I'm an activist, but to see people who, journalists, pastors, spiritual advisors, attorneys, who are all acting as professionals in their job, and even wardens and others who work for the Department of Corrections, having difficulty. The line was blurred between their job and they're still human. They're still human beings. And to witness this took a toll on them, whether they could articulate it or not. It was evident to me. I had one person say, "Oh, no, I wasn't traumatized." And this was execution that happened many years prior, because I've interviewed people who witnessed, like, literally a person in Oklahoma hours before the interview, all the way up to decades after the execution, to assess the longitudinal impact of the trauma. And somebody had witnessed execution years prior and said in one breath, "Oh, no, I wasn't traumatized by it." And not even 5 minutes later, I think about it every day. So I'm like, okay, maybe we don't understand what trauma is, you know?
Well, thank you very much for hooking me here and answering all these questions for Death Row Stories. I really appreciate.
I appreciate you doing this and talking to so many people and including me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.